Good day. My name is Gilbert Doctorow. Let me be direct with you from the very beginning. This morning, Sunday, the 10th of May, 2026, a drone struck a cargo vessel in the Persian Gulf, setting it ablaze in Qatari territorial waters. The ship had come from Abu Dhabi. It was a commercial vessel. Civilians were on board. There was a fire. The vessel managed to continue to Mesaid port after the blaze was extinguished. Qatar's defense ministry confirmed this attack. No one was killed this time. But the message was unmistakable to anyone willing to read it clearly. At precisely the same moment, we are being told by Reuters, by the BBC, by every major Western outlet, that Iran has responded to the United States peace proposal through its Pakistani mediator. That diplomacy is moving forward, that a deal is close. That Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the same man who just a few weeks ago was boasting that Washington had brought Iran to its knees, is now waiting by the phone for Tehran's answer. Let me ask you a very simple question. Can both of these things be true at the same time? Can a country that is genuinely interested in peace simultaneously be sending drones to set fire to cargo ships in the Gulf? And can a superpower that is genuinely committed to diplomacy simultaneously be blockading Iranian ports, sanctioning Chinese companies that sell Tehran drone components, and deploying Royal Navy destroyers toward the Strait of Hormuz? The answer, of course, is that we are living inside a contradiction. And contradictions, as any serious student of history knows, do not resolve themselves peacefully. They explode. What actually happened this week? Let me reconstruct the events of this past week for you, because the Western media has presented them in a highly fragmented and often deliberately confusing manner. On the 7th of May, this past Thursday, 3 United States Navy destroyers attempted to transit the Strait of Hormuz. This was not a routine patrol. This was a deliberate act of muscle flexing, what we used to call in the Cold War era a freedom of navigation operation, a show of force dressed up in the language of international law. The Iranian military responded. They fired missiles. They deployed drones. They used small assault boats. According to the Pentagon, all Iranian weapons were intercepted and none of the 3 destroyers was struck. President Donald Trump, speaking from Washington, confirmed this encounter on his Truth Social platform. He wrote, and I quote his words because they are revealing in their tone, that 3 world-class American destroyers had transited, quote, very successfully out of the Strait of Hormuz under fire. He then added, with the characteristic bravado that has defined his political persona across 2 terms, they trifled with us today. We blew them away. Now, let us pause here, because what Trump just described is not a peaceful transit through an international waterway. What Trump just described is a military engagement. Ships were fired upon. Weapons were deployed in anger. Men and women on both sides came within minutes of a catastrophe that could have restarted full-scale war. And yet, we are expected to believe that the ceasefire is still in effect. That diplomacy is still on track, that a deal is just around the corner. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, had a very different reading of these events. He posted on social media, and again, I paraphrase closely, that every time a diplomatic solution is placed on the table, the United States opts for what he called a reckless military adventure. He asked whether this was a deliberate pressure tactic or whether someone had once again, in his words, duped the President of the United States into another quagmire. These are not the words of a country that is preparing to sign a peace agreement. These are the words of a government that believes it has been betrayed, and that is signaling its displeasure in the only language that Washington has ever truly understood, the language of force. Iran's top joint military command went further. They accused the United States not merely of provocative behavior, but of targeting an Iranian oil tanker and another vessel. They described the American actions as a clear violation of the ceasefire understanding of April 8th. They invoked Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter. They used the phrase acts of aggression. These are precise legal terms. They are not used casually by foreign ministries. When a government reaches for the language of the UN Charter to describe its adversary's behavior, it is preparing a legal and political case, and quite possibly a military one as well. The drone strike on the Qatari waters, what it means. Now let us return to this morning's drone attack in Qatari territorial waters. I want to be careful here because attribution in this conflict has frequently been contested and frequently manipulated. We do not yet know with absolute certainty who launched this drone. Qatar's defense ministry has confirmed the attack. It has not, at least in its initial statement, made a direct attribution to Iran, given that Qatar is one of the 2 mediating countries, alongside Pakistan, in the current peace negotiations. A direct attribution to Iran would be diplomatically catastrophic. Qatar is not going to make that accusation lightly, if at all. But let us think about this logically. Who benefits from attacking commercial shipping in Qatari waters today, on the very day that Iran has delivered its response to the American peace proposal? There are only a few possible actors. Iran, sending a message that its military has not been defanged by diplomacy, some Iranian proxy or affiliated group acting without direct orders from Tehran, which would itself be alarming, suggesting a breakdown in command and control, or a third party attempting to sabotage the negotiations by provoking a crisis at this delicate moment. I have followed these kinds of maritime incidents closely since the Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping began back in 2023 and 2024. I have watched how attribution is handled, how evidence is selectively released, how the fog of war is deployed by all sides. What I can tell you is this: the timing of this attack is not coincidental. Nothing in the Persian Gulf happens by coincidence at this stage of the conflict. What we are witnessing is a form of coercive diplomacy that both sides have been practicing since the ceasefire took effect on April 8th. Iran keeps the pressure on through precisely calibrated military actions. Never enough to restart full-scale war, but never enough to convince Washington that Tehran has genuinely laid down its weapons. The United States, for its part, sends destroyers through the strait, blockades Iranian ports, and issues sanctions against Chinese intermediaries. Both sides are negotiating from positions of maximum leverage, and in that kind of negotiating environment, civilian cargo ships catch fire. Now, what exactly is in this American peace proposal that Iran has just responded to? Based on reporting from Reuters, from Al Jazeera, from CBS News, and from other sources I have been monitoring, Washington's latest proposal addresses three interconnected issues. First, a formal end to the war, meaning a cessation of all active hostilities, including the American blockade of Iranian ports. Second, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping on a permanent basis. And third, and this is the sticking point, the rollback of Iran's nuclear program. Tehran, according to the same reporting, would rather deal with the first two items now and leave the nuclear question for later discussions. This is entirely predictable and entirely logical from Iran's perspective. The nuclear program is Iran's ultimate leverage, its insurance policy against the kind of regime change operation that Washington and Tel Aviv launched on February 28th when they assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Asking Iran to surrender its nuclear leverage before a lasting peace framework is in place is, from Tehran's point of view, asking a man to put down his weapon before the man pointing a gun at him has holstered his own. The United States, unsurprisingly, disagrees. Mike Waltz, now the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, stated this week on Fox News that President Trump has set a very clear red line: Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. He added that Iran cannot hold the world's economies hostage. These are strong words. They are the kind of words that close doors rather than open them. Meanwhile, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian struck what one might describe as a tone of defiant pragmatism in a social media post on Sunday. He wrote, and I paraphrase, that Iran will never bow its head before the enemy, and that the fact that negotiations are taking place does not mean surrender or retreat. This is a message aimed as much at the Iranian domestic audience as at Washington. In any authoritarian or semi-authoritarian system, a leader who is seen to have capitulated to foreign pressure is a leader who loses power and quite possibly his life. Let us also note what Kevin Hassett, one of Trump's economic advisors, said this week on Fox News. He predicted that once the Strait of Hormuz is fully opened, quote, a gusher of oil will be released into the market and bring prices down, and he specifically noted that this would happen ahead of the midterm election. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment. Ahead of the midterm election, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which has been catastrophic for global energy markets, which has pushed Brent crude to approximately $100 per barrel, which has caused fuel shortages in parts of Asia and rationing in Pacific nations, is being discussed inside the Trump administration, primarily in terms of its domestic electoral implications. That is the reality of American foreign policy in 2026. Not strategic calculation, not geopolitical wisdom, electoral arithmetic. Pakistan, Qatar, and the mediation architecture. Before I continue, I want to say something about the role of Pakistan in this crisis, because it has received far too little attention in the Western press. Pakistan is not a neutral party in the classic sense. It is a majority Muslim country with deep cultural and religious ties to Iran. It is also a country that is heavily dependent on Gulf Arab states for remittances from its large diaspora workforce, and which maintains complex relationships with both the United States, which provides significant military and economic assistance, and with China, which has built infrastructure across Pakistan as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Pakistan's prime minister has been shuttling between Tehran, Washington, and Doha in recent weeks, performing a balancing act of extraordinary diplomatic delicacy. The fact that Iran chose to deliver its response to the American proposal through Pakistan is itself significant. It signals that Tehran trusts Islamabad, or at least finds it a more comfortable channel than dealing directly with Washington or with Qatar, which, despite its mediation role, is home to a significant American military presence at Al Udeid Air Base. Qatar's prime minister warned this week that using the Strait of Hormuz as a pressure card would only lead to deepening the crisis. This is a politely worded but unmistakable rebuke to Iran. The Qataris are in a uniquely uncomfortable position. They are hosting American troops, they are mediating for Iran, their own waters have just been attacked by a drone, and they are trying to push through an LNG tanker, the first Qatari vessel to attempt the strait since the war began, as a confidence-building gesture toward Pakistan. The fact that this Qatari LNG tanker's transit had to be pre-approved by Iran tells you everything you need to know about who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz today. It is not the United States Navy. Europe's position in the British destroyer. I must also address what Britain and France are doing because it is both important and deeply troubling. Britain announced this week that it is deploying HMS Dragon, a Type 45 destroyer, to the Middle East in preparation for a possible multinational mission to ensure safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz once hostilities cease. France is involved in the same planning. The two countries have co-hosted conferences on the subject. They have gathered the signatures of 38 countries on a statement expressing readiness to contribute to efforts to ensure safe passage. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Garibabadi responded to this British deployment with a warning that was, in my reading, absolutely unambiguous. He stated that the presence of French or British vessels, or those of any other country, for any cooperation with what he called illegal U.S. actions in the strait would be met with, quote, a decisive and immediate response from the armed forces. French President Macron attempted to soften this confrontation by clarifying that the proposed multinational mission would not be a military deployment in the traditional sense, but an international effort to secure shipping once conditions allow. That is a fine distinction that I suspect the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps will not observe if a French frigate appears in the strait's shipping lanes. What strikes me about the British and French position is its fundamental incoherence. These are two countries that did not participate in Operation Epic Fury, the American and Israeli strikes of February 28 that started this war. They voted with the United States for a UN Security Council resolution on Hormuz that China and Russia vetoed. And now they are proposing to send their navies to enforce a settlement that Iran has not yet agreed to. This is precisely the kind of initiative that risks transforming a bilateral American-Iranian conflict into a much broader confrontation. I do not say this lightly. I am a European resident. I have lived in Brussels for many years. I care deeply about European security, and it is precisely because I care that I must say clearly, Europe has no business deploying warships into a conflict zone on behalf of one party to a dispute that it did not start and does not fully understand. The oil market reality and global economic damage. Let me speak now about the economic dimensions of this crisis because they have been consistently underreported. Before February 28th, the Strait of Hormuz handled approximately 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade, roughly 20 million barrels per day. It handled a comparable share of global liquefied natural gas. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar all depend on this waterway for the bulk of their export revenues. When the strait closed, the consequences were not merely regional, they were global. Brent crude, the global benchmark, was trading at approximately $73 per barrel on the eve of the war. By this week, it had reached approximately $100 per barrel, a 37% increase in roughly 2.5 months. Gasoline prices in the United States have risen by more than 50% since the war began, according to reporting published just this week. Commercial traffic through the strait has fallen by more than 90%. Before the war, approximately 3,000 vessels used the strait every month. Today, that number stands at around 5% of its pre-war level. Shipping companies have rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of miles and enormous costs to every voyage. Insurance premiums for vessels attempting the strait, in the rare cases where passage is approved at all, have skyrocketed. The countries hit hardest by this disruption are not in Europe or North America. They are in South and Southeast Asia. Nations like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines, countries that depend on Gulf oil and LNG, and that lack the storage capacity and the alternative supply chains to absorb a sustained disruption. Fuel shortages and rationing have been reported across the region. And here is what I find most remarkable and most damning about the American approach to this crisis. A CIA assessment reported this week indicated that Iran would not face severe economic pressure from the U.S. blockade of its ports for approximately another 4 months. 4 months. That means the Trump administration's primary leverage tool, the port blockade, will take until September to bite. And September is when American domestic political attention shifts entirely to midterm preparations. The window for a deal, in other words, is very narrow. and both sides know it. What Iran actually wants. I want to speak plainly about Iran's strategic position, because it is almost universally mischaracterized in the Western press. Iran did not start this war. Let me say that again. Iran did not start this war. The United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iranian territory on February 28th, killing the supreme leader of a sovereign nation and destroying military and civilian infrastructure. Iran retaliated. Under any recognized principle of international law, Iran had the right to do so. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is, from Iran's perspective, a proportionate and entirely legal act of economic warfare in response to a military attack on its homeland. I am not expressing sympathy for the Iranian government. I have written critically about the Islamic Republic on many occasions. Its human rights record is abysmal. Its regional behavior has been destabilizing for decades, but legality and morality are not the same thing. And in this particular confrontation, the law is quite clearly on Iran's side, whatever one thinks of the regime. What Iran wants, what it has always wanted, is security. It wants a guarantee that the United States and Israel will not attempt regime change again. It wants sanctions relief. It wants the unfreezing of Iranian assets that have been held abroad for decades. It wants recognition as a legitimate regional power. These are not unreasonable demands. They are the demands that any government facing an existential threat would make. The nuclear question is more complicated. Iran's nuclear program has always served a dual purpose, a genuine civilian energy component and a strategic deterrent. Having watched the United States assassinate a sitting head of state, the Iranian leadership would have to be suicidal to surrender its nuclear deterrent before a comprehensive and legally binding security guarantee is in place. The Trump administration is asking Iran to do precisely that, and doing so while simultaneously deploying destroyers through the strait and sanctioning Iran's trading partners. This is not a formula for a peace agreement. This is a formula for continued crisis. I have deliberately held back my sharpest analysis for Marco Rubio because I believe his role in this crisis deserves careful and sustained examination. Marco Rubio is a man of considerable intelligence and very limited wisdom. He came of age politically in the maximalist tradition of American foreign policy, the tradition that believes American power is unlimited, that adversaries will always back down in the end, and that diplomacy is merely the continuation of coercion by other means. He was an enthusiastic supporter of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He was among those who cheered the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. He has consistently advocated for aggressive postures toward Iran, China, and Russia throughout his career. When the war with Iran began in late February, Rubio was its most vocal cheerleader in the administration. He appeared on television to declare that Iran had been severely degraded. He spoke confidently about Iranian capitulation. He made statements that were widely reported and widely praised in the mainstream press, that in retrospect were almost comically premature. And then, when it became clear that Iran had not capitulated, that the Iranian military was still firing missiles, that the strait was still closed, that the global economy was buckling under the pressure of disrupted energy flows, Rubio pivoted. He became the administration's lead diplomat. He began meeting with Qatari officials. He began talking about proposals and responses and frameworks. This week, Rubio said that Washington expected a response from Iran to its latest proposal within hours. That was Friday. As of this recording on Sunday, there is still no confirmed agreement. There is a response. Iran has delivered something through Pakistan, but its contents remain unknown, and there is no sign of an imminent deal. I do not know whether Rubio genuinely believes that a lasting peace is achievable on Washington's current terms. What I do know is that his credibility as a diplomat, as an analyst, as a strategist, has been severely damaged by this war. The man who declared Iran defeated is now waiting anxiously for Tehran's phone call. That is not a position of strength. That is the position of a government that has discovered, to its considerable surprise, that the world does not always bend to American will. Let me step back now from the immediate events and offer some broader observations about what this conflict means for the international order. The war that began on February 28, 2026 is not simply a bilateral conflict between the United States and Iran. It is a symptom of something much larger, the accelerating disintegration of the post-Cold War international order that the United States constructed in the 1990s and maintained, with varying degrees of success, through the first 2 decades of this century. That order rested on several foundational assumptions: that the United States was the world's indispensable power and its ultimate security guarantor, that international institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund would manage global disputes within a framework of rules that all major powers accepted, that American military supremacy was so overwhelming that no rational actor would dare to challenge it directly. All 3 of these assumptions have now been exposed as fiction. Russia's war in Ukraine, which I have been writing about since 2022, demonstrated that a major nuclear power could defy American-led sanctions and military pressure and survive. China's refusal to join Western sanctions against Russia demonstrated that the global economy was no longer organized around American preferences. The Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping demonstrated that even a comparatively minor armed group could disrupt global trade routes when properly equipped and motivated. And now Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz has demonstrated that a medium-sized power, under sufficient existential pressure, can impose enormous costs on the global economy and weather American military pressure without collapsing. This is the world that we now inhabit, a world where American power is real but limited, a world where determined adversaries can impose costs that American domestic politics, with its elections every 2 years and its relentless media cycle, cannot sustain indefinitely, a world where the with us or against us framework of American foreign policy has produced more enemies than friends. China and Russia vetoed the UN Security Council resolution on the Strait of Hormuz in April. That veto was not a minor procedural act. It was a statement about where Beijing and Moscow see their interests in this conflict, and those interests do not align with Washington's. Russia benefits from high oil prices. China has deep economic relationships with Iran and has no interest in seeing the United States emerge from this crisis with a sweeping strategic victory. The Trump administration, for all its talk of America first, has managed to unite its two most powerful strategic competitors against it in a conflict that did not need to happen and that serves no vital American national interest. Allow me to close with what I consider to be the three most plausible scenarios for the coming weeks. The first scenario is a deal. Iran and the United States reach a preliminary agreement, what would be called in diplomatic language a framework, that formally ends the war, begins the process of reopening the strait, and defers the nuclear question to subsequent negotiations. This is the scenario that the markets want. It is the scenario that Kevin Hassett was hinting at when he spoke of oil prices falling before the midterm elections. It is achievable, but only if the Trump administration is willing to accept terms that do not give it a clear propaganda victory, and only if Iran believes that any agreement will actually be honored. Given that the United States has a long history of withdrawing from agreements with Iran, most notably the JCPOA, from which Trump himself withdrew in his first term, Tehran's skepticism is entirely rational. A deal is possible. I would not rate it as probable. The second scenario is continued deadlock. The two sides exchange proposals and counterproposals through their Pakistani and Qatari intermediaries, while sporadic military incidents, like this morning's drone attack, continue in the Gulf. The strait remains largely closed. Oil prices stay elevated. The global economic damage accumulates slowly. Neither side is willing to make the concessions necessary for a real agreement, but neither side wants to restart full-scale war. This is an unstable equilibrium, but it could persist for months. The third scenario, and the one that I believe Western governments are not taking seriously enough, is escalation. A miscalculation, an incident that spins out of control. A drone that kills an American serviceman. A destroyer that makes a more aggressive transit than planned and finds itself in a genuine firefight. An Iranian missile that strikes a facility in a Gulf country, killing civilians from a NATO member state. Any one of these events could trigger a chain of decisions made under pressure, made in anger, made by political leaders who are afraid of appearing weak, that leads back to open war. I am not predicting that this will happen. I am saying that the conditions for it to happen exist today and that the people in charge of preventing it are not, in my assessment, fully in control of events. I began this analysis by asking whether two contradictory things could be true at the same time, that Iran is pursuing peace and simultaneously striking ships in the Gulf. The answer, I now hope you understand, is yes, but not in the sense that the Western press would have you believe. It is not hypocrisy. It is not irrationality. It is a rational, if dangerous, strategy of maintaining maximum leverage throughout the negotiating process. It is precisely what the United States itself is doing when it sends destroyers through the strait while simultaneously awaiting Iran's diplomatic response. We are watching two nuclear-capable powers, one directly, one indirectly through its Israeli ally, play a game of coercive diplomacy in one of the world's most critical strategic waterways. The cost of this game, measured in disrupted commerce, elevated energy prices, fuel shortages in developing nations, and the constant risk of miscalculation, is being paid by people who had no say in the decisions that started this war. Marco Rubio declared the war over. The ships are still burning. The strait is still closed. The drones are still flying. And somewhere in Islamabad, a Pakistani diplomat is carrying a sealed envelope that may or may not contain the beginning of a path out of this catastrophe. I will be watching. I will report what I see as honestly and as accurately as I can. That is what I have always done. That is what I intend to keep doing. Thank you for your attention.